So I think what we now have is a situation where we need a new non-alignment for our new circumstances, and that it cannot just be a non-alignment of the old type, but it has to be decidedly developmental in the sense of sustainable development, and it also needs to be pacifist.
Okay, everybody. My name is John Seidel, and I'm the director of the Sosui Hawk Southeast Asia Center here at the LSE. And on behalf of the center, I'd like to welcome you to our annual flagship Southeast Asia Forum, which is focused this year on the challenges of sustainable growth in Southeast Asia. Our thought at the center was that at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the LSE, we should have something focused on economics, the economies of the region, which are much more dynamic than the politics of the region, which we spent a lot of time talking about. But we don't have a full-time economist here at the LSE, like at many universities, focused on the region. So we've brought in some talent from far afield, from Malaysia, from Singapore, from Vietnam, and even from far-flung Australia with Dr. Eve Warburton, who'll be speaking later. So we're very excited to have this event today with four very distinguished and distinctive speakers whose work on the various aspects of the region's economies and the region's economy as a whole really goes beyond the standard garden variety sort of template of pie charts and graphs and brings a variety of different analytical perspectives to bear on the complex issues of economic growth, and in particular, sustainable economic growth across the varied economies of the region. I should thank our center manager, Jessica Landas, and also our communications assistant, Mutia Sukma, and our graduate intern, Kanpu Sun, for all their hard work in making this possible. We're hoping that today will go without any further technical hitches and that we'll have an interesting time and learn a lot in the course of the day. So let me introduce our first speaker, Jomo Kwame Sundaram. And I should say here that in inviting him to give the opening keynote speech for today's event, I was thinking a bit along the lines of real estate developers who, you know, have a shopping center or a shopping mall, and they get an anchor store around which they sort of organize everything else. And for me, Jomo was that anchor for today's event. Sadly, circumstances have conspired to make it impossible for him to join us in person, but he's enough of a presence that certainly having him online will be a huge boon and benefit to us all. If you look at his official bio blurb, he's a senior advisor at the Khazanah Research Institute in Malaysia, a fellow of the Academy of Sciences, Malaysia, emeritus professor at the University of Malaya. He was founder chair of the International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS. He is the assistant secretary general of the United Nations, running their Department of Economics and Social Affairs, UNDESA, for about a decade, 2005 through 2015. And he also received the 2007 Vasily Leontiev Prize for advancing the frontiers of economic thought. But beyond these accomplishments, these achievements, it's worth noting that Jomo is someone who represents a great deal more than just these achievements. He's long been a heterodox economist, offering very unorthodox, interesting, insightful ideas about the economies of Southeast Asia and the global South in general. If you read his regular postings, you'll see this to this day, but he's been doing this for many years. He's been an activist. He spent some time behind bars for his troubles. He's been a journalist, and of course, he's worked for the UN and been a major figure in the field of the study of Southeast Asian political economy and economic development. And here I remember from the 1980s and 1990s, his works on The Misunderstood Miracle, Tigers in Trouble, volumes that really offered the classic explanations for the distinctive patterns of growth that you found in Southeast Asia over the 80s and the 90s, and then the economic crisis in the region. So he has much to tell us today. He has years of experience tremendous insight, and he's a great speaker. So please join me in welcoming him to speak to us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Seidel, for this very kind words of introduction, but more importantly, for this invitation to join you today. First, I want to check that you are hearing me well.
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
great.
Thankfully.
I'm sorry, very, very sorry to you and to everybody else. I know your team has done a great job in terms of making the preparations for today's event. But owing to my accident, I am not able to be there in person. And I hope that this presentation through Zoom and the subsequent discussion will be of use to everybody who's interested. First, I think it's important for us to sort of put this whole discussion into context. What I basically am trying to argue is that we have seen a very interesting period stretching back at least 3 decades or more, when the East Asian miracle was being celebrated. And some of us made very important, I think, caveats to that argument, which was advanced by the World Bank, but funded really by the Japanese government. And basically what we have done is what we tried to do at that time was to moderate the celebration of the East Asian miracle, and especially the Southeast Asian component of it. Now, without rehearsing the entire debate, especially since it has we are already running a little bit behind time, allow me to emphasize that the celebration of that miracle ended from around 1995, and especially with 1997. 1995 because the strong yen, the endaka, came to an end at that time, and in 1997. We have, of course, the East Asian financial crisis and the political repercussions thereof, which affected the current Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, who was at that time Deputy Prime Minister, of course. What is also worthy of consideration is that we have had since then not only the miracle and the debacle, but also very importantly, I would like to argue that we have a very new conjuncture, both economically and politically, in the recent period. And that as a consequence of this new conjuncture, Southeast Asia is hesitantly trying to carve out a new space for itself in the international political economy. It's useful for us to begin to recognize that much of the new conjuncture which we find ourselves in is largely due to the US government policies from around 2008. 2008, of course, was the year of the global financial crisis, and subsequently, for a brief period, there was an attempt to use fiscal policies to try to revive the world economy. But this effort was largely abandoned within about a year or so, as the U.S. Fed began what is politely referred to as quantitative easing, basically defying many of the earlier understandings of monetary economics, which would basically turn, for example, Milton Friedman, the late Milton Friedman. I'm sure he would be turning in his grave if he saw what was happening during this period. But in any case, it seemed to work. It at least kept the world economy going with relatively low interest rates, but also a period where financialization became very, very significant, not only in the US with its particular variations thereof, but also in much of the rest of the world. More recently, however, especially for slightly over 2 years since the beginning of 2022, we have seen the US Fed raising interest rate hikes. there is a interesting debate going on in the US as to why this was considered deemed necessary. And some would argue that this was because labor was getting uppity after after over a decade of policies trying to ensure full employment. It's important for the world to remember that the US is the only US Fed is the only central bank in the world which has a commitment to full employment, in addition to the usual central bank's commitment to financial stability. So this meant that not only Obama, but also very importantly, Donald Trump, and more recently, Joe Biden, sustained policies which ensured close to full employment in the US. In this regard, the US is very exceptional in the world, and it's important for us to recognize what has happened, and that the interest rate hikes from 2022 have basically put an end to the great moderation of the recent period of the decade and a half or so from 2009. Now, accompanying this, especially in the developing countries, we have seen a number of fiscal crises, very often relating to debt crisis, and some of us have been discussing this new debt crisis in very significant as a very significant new a problem which many developing countries, including those in Southeast Asia, will need to deal with. But I will point out later that Southeast Asia, there have at least been a couple of instances where some of the Southeast Asian central banks have been quite innovative in terms of dealing with this problem. So we have seen, of course, about a decade ago, the collapse of commodity prices as demand slackened after the attempts to with declining demand. And basically, many people would characterize the period since 2009 as a period of stagnation in much of the world economy. And the problem has been exacerbated in the recent period, partly for political reasons, but also partly for reasons having to do with the politics of the United States. Now, more recently, I think it's important for us to recognize that developing countries cope with the raising of interest rates in the West, particularly in the US, but also in Europe, rather differently from how the rest of the world copes with it. And so what we have seen in the United States has been a significant increase in interest rates. And this has meant that there has been a flight of capital from what may be termed the global south to the global north, particularly to the US, but also arguably to Europe. Now, all this, of course, happens in a period where there have been growing tendencies towards what might be called the Second Cold War. Geopolitics has been quite significant in the recent period, and depending on who or what interpretation of American politics one has, one would argue that there has been a period where the military spending and associated spending has become extremely significant. I mention associated spending because the U.S. Defense Department budget has, of course, is very significant. It exceeds the military spending of all the next 19 countries combined. So it is way above everybody else. One might argue that they don't necessarily get much value for money, but I think that is a secondary consideration. Also, very importantly, we have seen the normalization of trade disruptions for geopolitical reasons. Now, of course, COVID-19 was not a geopolitical factor, although many would incline towards conspiracy theories, would argue that many of the policies which were adopted during this period were not especially necessary to deal with the pandemic. But more importantly, with the Ukraine war, the normalization of sanctions has become important. But even before that, the policies of President Trump as well as Prime Minister Abe, sought to disrupt not only trade flows, but also investment flows with policies such as reshoring and then later friendshoring. So access to market access is no longer governed by the rules of the World Trade Organization. And ironically, we find that in the recent period, arguably for almost a decade now, it is the China more than anybody else which is campaigning for trade liberalization and market access more than the West, which were historically campaigning for it. This reminds us, of course, of the situation in the mid-19th century when the UK began to argue for more free trade, precisely when it had succeeded in having technological advantages in the Industrial Revolution. So what we see is a whole range of ways in which not only trade and investment, but also technology and a whole range of other sanctions on more spuriously political grounds have been introduced. So I think it's important for us to recognize this because in the past, many economists have been disinclined to look at the political in relation to the economic, but I think no self-respecting economist can afford to do so anymore. Now, it's also important for us to recognize that the raising of interest rates in many instances has actually resulted in the raising of prices, or what economists would refer to as cost push inflation. Now, all this basically means that there has been a great deal of distractions from many of the previous concerns about global challenges, not only climate change, but also, of course, sustainable development with which developing countries are especially concerned. And we see a displacing of those kinds of concerns in favor of the other types of concerns which have preoccupied the Western leadership more recently. I want to just remind ourselves, because very often people think that there is nothing to be really achieved through multilateral cooperation. In 1979, that's a long way back for most of the audience, but in 1979, Jimmy Carter, then President of the United States, accepted the Soviet challenge to try to eradicate smallpox. And within less than a decade, I want to remind everybody, the US, working together with the Soviet Union at that time, eradicated smallpox large from the face of the earth. This, I think, was a considerable achievement, but it also reminds us of what can be achieved if there is far more multilateral cooperation and far more cooperation, for example, in terms of the sharing of technology, in terms of working towards climate change and so on. And I would argue, but this is not appropriate right now, that there have been huge setbacks in recent times, ever since the Glasgow Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So what we find now is that the multilateral institutions in the world today have been undermined more than ever. I'm referring, of course, primarily to the United Nations system, of which I had the honor of serving. But it's also important to remind ourselves that although the World Trade Organization is not part of the UN system, for reasons the West insisted on, what we find right now is a situation where the World Trade Organization is not allowed to function effectively. Many of the norms agreed to as less than 3 decades ago in the Marrakesh Declaration of 1994 and the launching of the World Trade Organization in 1995 are very, very selectively invoked. And by and large, they have been largely abandoned. So all this basically means a greater legitimization in practice for the violation of multilateral norms and whatever law may exist. And this, I think, is extremely important to remember. Think, for example, about what has happened with the Glasgow commitments just barely less than 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. These have largely been abandoned, and in terms of the practices of the West in recent times. Now, moving on very quickly, I think it's useful for us to remember that one of the big differences between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, for example, in the earlier period, was a much greater reliance on foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia. And this, I think, is part of the reason why I have argued for decades that Southeast Asia's industrialization and progress has been severely compromised and limited precisely because of this. And foreign direct investment has been important not only for Singapore, which has had, relatively speaking, the highest levels of foreign direct investment, but also for countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and so on and so forth. So it's important to contrast this with how China, for example, has managed its earlier labor surplus economy and made various achievements. So China, in a sense, fits in slightly in between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, at least in this respect, the role of foreign direct investment, which has many implications, I would argue, and also the potential for industrial policy in China has been significantly reduced by its earlier reliance on foreign direct investment, but also the fact that now Janet Yellen, for example, is complaining about Chinese overproduction, overinvestment in green goods. Many would ask, for example, what's wrong with that if China wants to subsidize the greening of the world economy? One would welcome the cheaper batteries, the cheaper solar panels, and the cheaper electric vehicles which China is producing. But of course, this is not in the current discourse. I'm going to show you a few graphs which basically emphasize the level of trade openness in different parts of the world and some of its implications, particularly in terms of income distribution and particularly for wages or for industrial workers, but generally speaking, for most workers, because of the higher wages available for manufacturing sector workers. And one can also see that in the recent period, China has become the major trading partner for Southeast Asia. This is not insignificant because this basically means that relying on Southeast Asia to isolate China is something which most Southeast Asian countries would find very difficult. Not only because often China is the major trading partner for countries in Southeast Asia, as in much of the rest of the developing world, I should emphasize, not only in Africa, but also in much of Latin America and the Caribbean. So all this basically means that we live in a very different world than existed as recently as a dozen years ago when Xi Jinping first took over the leadership of the People's Republic. Now, moving on, I think it's also important to recognize that that setting back the GDP of China has adverse implications for the countries of Southeast Asia, as this bar chart reminds us. And most of all, ironically, it is the most pro-Western country in Southeast Asia, Singapore, which would be most adversely affected. And this may explain how Singapore has slowly shifted its position from being very solidly pro-US to being more ambiguous in its stance vis-a-vis the US and China. But you can see that most other countries in Southeast Asia would be severely adversely affected if you contrast this with Northeast Asia, both Japan as well as Korea. Now, it's important also to recognize that ASEAN has also been trying to diversify away from China. Japan remains a major source of foreign direct investment and imports, and has promoted the idea of friendshoring in Southeast Asia. But with the likelihood that there will be greater protectionism against Southeast Asia because Southeast Asia is quite competitive in a number of areas. I want to mention, for example, photovoltaic solar panels, where China produces 71% of the world's output. But the number two countries are Korea, South Korea, and Malaysia. In the case of Korea, most of the companies are Korean companies, and it mainly produces for domestic consumption. But in the case of Malaysia, almost an entire output is exported. And there still hasn't been a significant transition to photovoltaic solar panels in Malaysia. There was an earlier period when Taiwan attempted a so-called southward strategy to diversify from China but that has not really been sustained. And Korea has continued to maintain an interest, especially in Vietnam, but its earlier interest in Indonesia has flagged in recent decades. Now, moving on very quickly, I think I have to acknowledge that much of the work which I'm going to present in the form of graphs has actually been done not by me, but by the first managing director of the deputy managing director of the IMF. Not a source I normally cite so heavily, but nonetheless, Professor Gita Gopinath has actually, at least her staff, has helped her produce a number of graphs which basically make the case for non-alignment. In other words, I'm going to make an argument which is for non-alignment for developing countries or the global south in the forthcoming period. But it's also important for us to recognize that this turn towards the global south this turn towards non-alignment is something which will affect most developing countries, because most developing countries have China as a very, very major trading partner, as well as a source of investment. So, Gita Gopinath points out that the geopolitical tensions and the kind of protectionism which is driving a lot of policies in the West, and I can elaborate on that later if there's interest, is basically hugely problematic for developing countries, and I would argue especially for Southeast Asia. So to run straight to her conclusion, she basically concludes that non-alignment is the best way to cushion the geo-economic fragmentation effects. And I would refer you to the case of the USMCA, previously known as NAFTA, where Mexico has become a very, very major beneficiary of the US-China political tensions, where it is attracting a great deal of Chinese investment and accessing the US market, where these Chinese investors basically access the US market indirectly through Mexico. So if we look at the situation, you can see from this bar chart that the countries which are most adversely affected by what has been happening are really the developing countries. The developing countries have been adversely affected by a drop in GDP as a consequence of much of what has been happening. And all this was already happening before the pandemic. It's important to recognize that this is not a post-pandemic situation, that it only begins with the Cold War. But I would argue, and some of the graphs will show that the situation has been greatly exacerbated, greatly worsened by more recent developments. Now, first, let us remind ourselves a little bit about what happened in the first Cold War. The first Cold War between the West, the collective West, and the Soviet Union, and its allies, which were relatively limited. We are talking about a relatively few economies, and the Soviet bloc trading through what was called Comic-Con in those days, was very important. And Professor Seidel, is very familiar with the Soviet speak from that period. And one finds that the period of globalization almost coincides with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this, of course, has been very important. So the integration of China and arguably even India and the Soviet Union into international economic relations has been extremely important in terms of some of the developments. But this basically means that the context for Cold War II is actually very different from the context for the First Cold War. And therefore, it's important for us to begin to think very strategically, both in terms of economic considerations as well as political considerations against this new backdrop, a backdrop which is quite remarkably different from that of the First Cold War. So one finds, of course, that there have been a great number of distortions of what by the IMF itself refers to as distortions affecting trade and investment flows. And this, of course, have greatly increased since around 2018. In other words, they increased even before the pandemic, because there's been a tendency to suggest that it all begins with the pandemic. Some would even go earlier and point out and argue that it begins very much with the second Obama administration from 2013, when Obama basically embraces the strategy which had previously only been mentioned by Hillary Clinton of pivoting, the pivot to Asia. The pivot to Asia was basically a declaration of the Second Cold War, where China became the new enemy. And this basically coincided with the time of Xi Jinping's ascendance as the leader of the People's Republic of China. So all this, so the current demonization of Xi Jinping as tyrannical and so on and so forth, it has to be seen very much within this context. It doesn't begin only in the recent period. And it's also important to recognize that one of the consequences of the Deng Xiaoping's black cat, white cat argument is that you basically have a very significant role for private capital. And if we look at what has been happening in the last 4 decades or so in China, it is really the role of private capital which has become so much more significant. This, I think, is important for us to recognize, because it implies basically that you have a situation of capitalism. The capitalism is the only game in town at the world level, with some small exceptions such as North Korea and so on. But it basically means capitalism is the only game in town, and that you have variations of capitalism, as people like Michel Albert have been arguing from the 1980s. So if we look at some of the geopolitical risks and the kinds of arguments which have been made indicating geopolitical risks, you will see that there is a spike from the end of 2021. Okay, so contrary to the belief that it is Joe Biden would be a moderating influence compared to Donald Trump, in fact, there is some evidence to suggest that perhaps the train had left the station, and geopolitical risks have basically been running pretty much on their own due to inertia, momentum, etc. Now, moving on, I think it is important to also recognize that trade disruptions, that trade has become much more significant, and the implications of the Cold War for trade also extremely significant. So in the left bar here, one sees that the Cold War had a relatively limited effect. The first Cold War had a relatively limited effect on international trade because far less of the world was integrated into the world economy in the sense that we understand that word today. So economic integration has taken on new significance, new meaning in the more recent period. Now the other thing to emphasize is that if we look at the non-aligned countries and the number of people in the non-aligned countries in the first period compared to the second period, the number of people who were identified with non-alignment in the earlier period was less than half. Today, it is two-thirds of the world population. And it's not because of faster demographic growth in the recent period. In other words, the likelihood of support for non-alignment is far greater today. And remember that in contrast, what constitutes the Eastern Bloc, depending on how it's calculated, I think the IMF basically looks at China and Russia. But even if you add Iran to that bloc, it would not significantly change the fact that it's barely over a fifth of the world population, which is in the Eastern Bloc. But note also that the Western Bloc is not especially large. That too has reduced, relatively speaking. So if we look at trade between and within blocs and with the non-aligned movement, again, the case is made rather strongly by the evidence on trade that non-alignment has been extremely significant. Non-aligned countries have account for much more of trade than was previously the case. And this, I think, is extremely important. Remember also that in the period right after the global financial crisis, the countries which closed up much more were not the developing countries on the so-called emerging economies, but rather the countries of the Western Bloc. So the reversal is not something terribly new, but it is now much more explicit and made much clearer by various developments. Now, the change in trade growth post-war and is also very significant, and you will see that the trade change in trade growth, which has been adversely affected, has been greatest between the so-called new blocks. Okay, and this is captured by the bar chart on the screen right now. Now, moving on quickly, I think it's important for us to recognize that you have similar effects as far as foreign direct investment is concerned, and this is not surprising and was most pronounced during the period of not only of President Donald Trump, but also Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. Now, moving on, I think it's important to recognize that the role of China in terms of accounting for U.S. imports has also declined quite considerably in the recent period. So the scope for U.S. sanctions is actually considerably reduced. But it also means that if you impose more sanctions on China, you are basically contributing to inflation, because it basically raises the cost of the goods which one is buying from China. So this has implications not only for the US, but also for US allies. And this is playing, and there are very interesting debates, for example, in Europe over this and some of its implications. Again, the FDI issue and the role of China in relation to this is captured by this graph. And I would like emphasize that the the change in U.S. import share as a share of export shares from China has basically declined quite significantly and quite precipitously since 2017, as these last two graphs remind us. Now, it's important also to take note of the two beneficiaries here, namely Mexico as well as Vietnam. So it's important to recognize that, again, the case can be well made for remaining non-aligned in developing countries. Now, looking at the question of supply chains and supply links, again, you can see similar consequences. I won't elaborate on this bar chart or the next one, but basically this one reminds us that trade fragmentation, which is the polite IMF term for what is happening right now, sanctions and various other supply side disruptions or trade disruptions, is very, very considerable when you look at what is happening. And consider, for example, the blue line here, which really refers to the advanced economy. So, the fact that the fact that you have a very significant change in the openness, the very promoters of trade liberalization and globalization in the earlier period are now the main enemies of trade liberalization and globalization. And of course, the problem for many developing countries, especially the poorest developing countries, they have been forced over the last few decades to open up their economies. They have adopted various policies which have opened up the economies not only to trade, but also much more to trade and also to foreign direct investment. And this has basically meant undermining of food security, and whatever little manufacturing capacity which had emerged has largely collapsed. This is most stark in the case of Africa, but it's also true of many other countries in the world. Now, so again, the implications of fragmentation of foreign investment are captured by this bar chart as in the previous one. Now, let me quickly move on to asserting that non-alignment is really the case for non-alignment has been rather eloquently made by the IMF. Curiously enough, it is not surprising that the IMF's leadership has been under pressure in the earlier period, and it's important to recognize that the managing director of the IMF grew up in Bulgaria, later on did a PhD at MIT in urban and regional planning, not unlike Gozzi, the head of the World Trade Organization. But also the deputy managing director she has recruited is from Indian born, although she probably is a US citizen at this stage, because that position of the first deputy managing director has always been reserved for an American citizen. And this has been extremely important. So you have a very, the very experience, the life experiences of officials has not been insignificant in terms of their understanding of the world and what may be best for the world going forward. So let me now return to the larger subject, having shown you these graphs, most of which have come from the IMF. It's not the IMF itself which has published this, but rather Geeta Gopinath, the first managing director, who delivered this in a speech to the International Economic Association at the end of last year. So what we find now is that the unipolar world, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and so on and so forth, basically signaled a victory for the Cold War, in the Cold War for the West, and especially for the United States. But precisely at this moment as well, one finds that this period is also associated with what economists refer to as financialization, which has had huge implications. And it is that financialization which I would argue contributed to the East Asian financial debacle. In fact, I would argue that the collapse of the Japanese um, uh, 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 post-war boom is also related to financialization and the attempt by the Japanese to have a so-called financial Big Bang in 1989. But moving on very quickly, I think it's important for us to recognize that the economic downturns accelerated. Economic downturns have accelerated various policy U-turns in the recent period, and this, I think, is important for us to recognize. So it is not as if economic factors have not influenced the policy changes, but as I tried to argue earlier, many of the changes have actually been due to what are politely referred to as geopolitical considerations rather than economic considerations. So, one should recognize that industrial capitalism, including whatever industry which has emerged in developing countries, has largely been undermined by liberalization, with the exception of East Asia and a few other countries. And this has largely been in the context of so-called supply chains of various types. Now, all this has meant a variety of factors, and I think it's important to recognize that the period of quantitative easing, especially in the middle of the last decade, enabled a great deal of wealth concentration, but that is taking us far from the topic of today's discussion, so I won't get into all that right now. But it's important to recognize that developing countries in Southeast Asia have continued to recognize the need to try to generate jobs and incomes for their populations during this period. And these priorities have changed, partly under the influence of earlier policies, but now the new circumstances will, I would argue, necessitate yet another change. So the new Cold War is forcing Southeast Asians to consider to take sides in the engagement, and I would argue that Southeast Asia should, particularly as with regards to the new Cold War, should continue to maintain a policy which was agreed to in 1973, namely the establishing Southeast Asia as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. It should not align itself with either of the contending partners for a whole range of reasons, and I'll be happy to discuss some of this if there is interest in them in the coming period. Now, many of you are, of course, very familiar with much of what has transpired over the last few decades, 3.5 decades. You will remember the celebration of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so on. This was interpreted as the collapse, the triumph of liberal capitalism. I think even Francis Fukuyama today would probably be much more modest about his earlier claims, and I don't think anybody really sustains a full the Fukuyama argument in full. But nonetheless, I think it is important to recognize that, at least for the time being, capitalism has triumphed. But I want to emphasize that there are a variety of capitalisms, and this, I think, is part of the problem which we face right now, because it is not really a difference between different types of economic systems, or even an ideological struggle. Let's face it, Mr. Putin makes no bones about proclaiming himself as a full-fledged capitalist and so on. So I think it's important for us to recognize that we are living in a different situation. And in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War, you know, the most earnest effort to develop a view was for somebody who cut his teeth in Southeast Asia, namely Paul Wolfowitz, with his so-called Wolfowitz doctrine, which was announced at the end of the Bush Jr. period. And it's important for us to recognize that ever since then, Russia was expelled from the G8. There was a brief period many people have forgotten for about at least half a decade when when Russia was invited to join the G7, and an expanded G7 was called the G8, was established at the beginning of this century. But that is no longer deemed viable. That was an attempt. President Bush Jr. Actually argued that he had looked into the eyes of Vladimir Putin and he had seen the hand of God. I think many of you might be rather amused by such claims today, but it's very important for us to recognize how things have changed. So what we find now is an important so-called pivot to Asia, which as I mentioned earlier, Obama basically launched the new Cold War with. And we have seen a number of developments which I've already made mention of, involving people like Trump and Abe, reshoring, and more recently and more importantly, I would argue, so-called friendshoring. And we have a variety of responses in terms of responses to the Second Cold War, and I would argue that the most viable one is that of non-alignment. And I would also like to argue that it is important for us to recognize that this non-aligned movement also necessarily has to be pacifist, because with the continuing heightening of the Second Cold War, we are seeing a great diversion of very, very scarce resources away from the sustainable development goals, or even climate change towards more military and so-called strategic purposes. And this, I would argue, is likely to condemn many people, especially in the global south, to a great deal of socioeconomic misery. Now, many of you might argue that I've basically made a case about the US. And here I want to quote the High Representative for the European Commission and Vice President for the European Commission, the Catalan Josep Borrell. Borrell basically argues that it is the South, the South, the global South, the developing countries are a great threat to Europe, to the Europe's so-called Garden of Eden, if you will, and that rather than wait for the South to threaten the North and Europe in particular, it is necessary, therefore, to go and invade the South. And Borrell made these remarks less than 2 years ago. More recently, he's made other remarks which have also been controversial for other reasons. But I think it's important to recognize that the sentiment in Europe is not very different from the sentiment in the United States. The range of forces are quite different, but I think there is a shared sense of threat which is felt in Europe, as summarized by Mr. Borrell's remarks. Now, let us revisit very, very quickly some of the considerations as far as non-alignment is concerned. During the Cold War, as everybody may remember, A number of military alliances were created, NATO, CENTO, CETO, etc. But most of these did not have a life beyond a few years or perhaps a decade or so. It is NATO which has basically survived, and NATO which is basically calling the shots today. And I think there is very little doubt in anybody's mind that it is the US which runs the roost at NATO. Now, the response from developing countries was quite early, and in Bandung, in Indonesia, in 1955, Sukarno hosted the first Afro-Asian meeting, and it is important to remember that the only countries to come were basically from Africa were basically Ethiopia and Egypt. Okay, and because the rest of sub-Saharan Africa basically had not achieved independence, and so the world as we see it today is one where there are over 50 African countries, and mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a very different world in which we live. Now, to be fair to the United States, I think it's important to remember that Eisenhower and Foster Dulles did not participate and did not support the UK, French, and Israeli invasion of the Suez Canal in 1956. This was a very important, and it resulted in a rift between the US and Europe, which lasted almost a full decade until the death, at least until the death of Kennedy. And there are many things which one can go into as far as that period is concerned. But it's also important to recognize that around this time as well, Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia, who had broken with Stalin and Stalin's successors, had tried to carve a different path, not only for his own country, the then Yugoslavia, but also tried to encourage others to not to align with the Soviet bloc. And this was a very important and gave birth to the non-aligned movement, or the formal birth of non-aligned movement in 1961. In ASEAN, as I mentioned, after the establishment of ASEAN in 1967, which was a repudiation of sorts to the earlier American proposal of a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or CETO, we have the subsequent consolidation of the Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality. Those involved in it were all anti-communist. Let us be very clear about the people involved in 1973. There was not, Vietnam had not joined, and neither had the governments of Cambodia or Laos at that time. And I mentioned earlier the role of multilateral cooperation as far as smallpox eradication, but there are other examples which can be cited as well. And then you have, of course, very important developments during the end of the 1980s with Gorbachev's rise and the attempts at perestroika, as well as perestroika, I think, is the most important one, but there was also glasnost, which I think was probably much more problematic. In any case, many would now argue that the non-aligned movement of the 60s to the 1980s, and many would disagree on its relevance, but many would argue that, well, okay, even if it played a useful role in that period, it's no longer relevant. I would like to put it to you that, in fact, it is perhaps a non-alignment as an idea is more relevant than ever. Whether or not one continues the earlier non-alignment is something to be argued about. But I think it's very important to recognize that developing countries do not have a single organization of their own in the world today. There are Of course, regional organizations, the African Union, there are groups within Latin America. There's virtually nothing in Asia as a whole. And there are sub-regional organizations of varying degrees of effectiveness, and ASEAN is probably one of the most effective ones, certainly within the Asian region. So the question becomes that of what does one do in this situation? And I think it's important for us to recognize that we are living in a situation now where multilateralism is under grave threat. Many people are questioning the relevance of the United Nations. I would make a case for that, but I won't do that right now. But I think it's very important to recognize that the world elite, the lords of the universe, so to speak, who meet in Davos every January, are basically setting global norms for in their own interest at the world level. And as we have been reminded by Professor Katerina Pistor at Columbia Law School, but who, she has done an excellent book about how crucial law is for capitalism. It's also important to recognize that she started her PhD research was on Southeast Asia, and she cut her teeth working on Southeast Asia, and it's very, very relevant to the modern contemporary understanding the role of property rights, of contractual rights, and a whole range of other things. But one needs to recognize the limitations thereof, especially in international law, where we see increasing violations of what we thought were international legal norms in various different ways. So I think what we now have is a situation where we need a new non-alignment for our new circumstances, and that it cannot just be a non-alignment of the old type, but it has to be decidedly developmental in the sense of sustainable development, and it also needs to be pacifist. Now, if I can just basically put it to you that we have an opportunity here because, in a sense, Southeast Asia, ASEAN specifically, had endorsed non-alignment at a fairly early time for Southeast Asia to provide that leadership. Unfortunately, my own view currently is that Southeast Asia leadership in Southeast Asia has been compromised by a whole variety of factors, which I don't have time to elaborate. But I think we have a leadership lacuna in Southeast Asia, and there is also a presumed hierarchy. And while Joko Widodo may well have provided such leadership, it is unclear that that General Prabowo would be inclined to provide that kind of leadership. Remember that his father, the late Professor Sumitro, had worked very closely with the CIA in the 1958 rebellions against Sukarno, and there is very little indication that he would be so inclined. So this basically means that the real leadership of ASEAN, the biggest country, the most significant country, Indonesia is not going to step into the breach, and neither is Singapore likely to do so, despite its recent shifts in its position. So we have a leadership lacuna in Southeast Asia. Whether this will change remains to be seen. I'm sure the minds of many Malaysians or Malaysian scholars will turn to whether or not Malaysia will try to provide that kind of leadership, given the current, given the fact that Malaysia will chair ASEAN next year. But this requires a great deal of work, building a new non-alignment, and it's unlikely that this is on the range of priorities of the current leadership of the very difficult coalition which leads Malaysia today. So let me thank you all for your attention. I'm sorry for starting late, and I want to thank you all for your interest, and I hope I have been clear enough in this discussion so far. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jomo, for a really fascinating, wide-ranging discussion and an articulation of an important position in global debates that we need to take seriously, especially from here in London, thinking about Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian perspectives. We have time for some questions. For those of you who are joining us online, please put your questions in the Q&A, or people often do it in the chat, even though we ask for the Q&A. But I'd like us to begin here in the room, take questions from people here live in person. And if you could give your name, your affiliation, and then your question briefly. Let's take a few questions since we have limited time left. So over to you in the audience. Yes?
My microphone doesn't seem to be working.
We can hear you, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Matthew Finlay. I work at the UK Foreign Office. Really interesting to hear the presentation. Just as a small factual point, I think the quote on Putin was that Bush got a sense of his soul rather than seeing in the hand of God. But nonetheless, it was an interesting statement. But more to the point, you talk about the pressures on the non-aligned to make choices, and I'd like to ask, particularly in reference to Southeast Asia, where do you think it is on what issues do you think they will be forced to choose in a broader geopolitical context? Because my sense is that the countries of the region don't want to choose and are kind of firmly sticking to the principle of non-alignment. And that seems to be a strategy that works quite well for them. And so, but it would be interesting to hear if there are going to be issues arising that force them to choose. Thank you.
Great question. Any other questions from the room? Should we take a look in the chat, Q&A, see if there are questions there? Or no? Okay, so let's go with that question. Jomo, could you hear the question?
No, I'm afraid not.
Okay.
Basically,
could you please summarize it?
Paraphrase, John?
Yeah, I think so. So this is Matthew Finlay from the Foreign Office, and he was suggesting that in his view and from his analysis of Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian countries, Southeast Asian populations do not want to choose. They want to maintain that position of independence and neutrality. But the question then remains, what issues are there which are forcing or nudging or being sort of pressured upon Southeast Asians, on which they are being pressed to make these difficult choices? What are the real crunch areas? I think that might summarize what Matthew's asking.
Thank you very much, Mr. Finlay. It's very difficult to answer this question without a review of all the different considerations involved. For example, I don't think there's much enthusiasm in Southeast Asia for some of the alliances which, say, Australia has chosen to take in relation to the United States. And the deployment of an aircraft carrier, of one of the two UK aircraft carriers to the South China Sea, is also not seen as, but very enthusiastically by people in Southeast Asia. But for the time being, there are enough distractions to distract people from a larger consideration. I think the real crunch will come about when, as the economic consequences of the new Cold War will adversely affect trade and investment, and most importantly, of course, growth in Southeast Asia. There's already the threat of tariffs against photovoltaic solar panels in Southeast, made in Malaysia, and this will of course upset many people. If we look, for example, at what has happened with palm oil coming from Indonesia, which is the largest, and I'm sure Ms. Kaur will speak to this later. some of the considerations in Southeast Asia. Let me put it this way: I don't think Southeast Asia looks kindly upon what has happened. And then with CBAM is a Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It is, everybody now recognizes it as a new form of protectionism. So I'm afraid, there is relatively little room for goodwill on the economic front. But I think you are absolutely correct that nobody in Southeast Asia wants to fall foul of the West. And we would like to maintain an equidistant relationship as far as economic relations are concerned. But whether or not we will be allowed to do so remains to be seen. Take, for example, the UK's application to join CPTPP. The CPTPP is an anachronism. It was originally introduced by Japan and its allies to try to keep the US interested in the original Trans-Pacific Partnership. But today, the CPTPP has really little to offer. And while some trade dogmatists who cannot see any so-called free trade agreement which they don't like to join, the fact of the matter is that it really offers very little. And then many of the issues which the US itself has flagged, Robert Lighthizer, for example, the former US trade representative, explained that when the US had withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership precisely because of the provisions in the CPTPP for something called ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. Now, Australia has already withdrawn from the, has already qualified its various commitments to ISDS. Many countries in Southeast Asia are rather worried about it. But nonetheless, I think the UK application is not a qualified application. It does not seek to do away with ISDS. So there are increasing concerns that the type of relationship relations which are being attempted would not be, to put it politely, sufficiently post-neocolonial. Okay, to be of much interest to Southeast Asian countries. So yes, Southeast Asia countries will want to maintain relations, and I'm here referring, of course, to governments rather than the peoples. Peoples of Southeast Asia have very, very mixed interests and agendas, and I cannot claim to speak for all of Southeast Asia as far as that is concerned. But I think you are absolutely correct in saying that no one in Southeast Asia wants to take sides. And I certainly was not trying to advocate that for one moment. There are enough problems, for example, between several littoral Southeast Asian countries with, for example, China, which insists on adhering to the rule of law, but does not seem to seek a resolution of its disputes with Southeast Asian countries on the basis of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So there are enough issues to keep for Southeast Asia to want to maintain equidistance, and this, I think, is extremely important. Thank you.
Great. We have a bunch of other questions. Maybe we'll bundle them up now, the ones that we have in the Q&A in the chat. So Victor Tan from Malaysia asks, in what ways, in the face of, sort of crunch areas or serious issues, could we establish a framework legalistically or otherwise, and with what forms of international institutional cooperation to mitigate the possibility of having our hands forced in the days ahead, either individually as a bloc? So this is we, presumably for Southeast Asia. Johnson Paris from Sri Lanka asking, is the UN and its various committees on economic development becoming less competent to drive economic developmentalism globally? And then if we could go to the chat, there's some questions there we should look at as well. I think there was one from Robert Wade. Oh, here we go. In the context of regional multilateralism, what is the condition of what's the status, the state of play with the Chiang Mai initiative multilateralism? Okay, I think that's it. Are there more there? I don't see any more. Okay, let's go with those.
Yes, thank you. I'm afraid I didn't hear the second question, but as far as the first question is concerned, I think these are things to be negotiated among the ASEAN member nations. And obviously, the kinds of the interests which, say, let us say, Singapore would be quite different from the interests of, say, Laos. And so these are things to be resolved as a group. But more broadly speaking, the diversity of developing countries and diversity of interests in developing countries is so complex that there are only a few principles in which they can broadly agree. And the existing ones are those which they have already signed on to, namely to the Sustainable Development Goals and also to the various climate conventions. So that would be, in my view, a good starting point. The Climate Convention, at least as elaborated in the Paris Agreement, as inferior as that is to the Kyoto Protocol, rather than, let us say, the Glasgow commitments, which have already been violated in any case within half a year after the conclusion of the Glasgow Conference of Parties with the outbreak of war and so on and so forth. Now, let me go to the third question, which I think I heard, and that is the whole question of Chiang Mai. I think it's very important to recognize there has been relatively little progress over the last 2 decades, more than 2 decades, as far as Chiang Mai is concerned. And perhaps the level of ambition envisaged by some of the supporters of the Chiang Mai initiative were too ambitious. The sense of vulnerability is now relatively low because of what happened in 1997, 98 is a distant memory for many of the governments involved. And let's face it, it was basically 3 countries in ASEAN who were most affected. And so the sense of vulnerability is not necessarily widely shared. But I think it's very important for us to recognize, given the threats of major financial disruptions, on rather flimsy pretexts, and so this basically poses the possibility of countries being held to ransom and here I think the ambition to try to raise the level of cooperation from what are basically a series of bilateral swap agreements to a regional multilateral swap agreement is important. And the requirement of its subordination and acceptability to the IMF is again problematic. Right now, perhaps we might, ASEAN countries may not be concerned about the IMF requirement because of the openness of the governments, the leadership of IMF to consider to be much more open on some of these issues. But I think there is a need, an urgent need to rethink what cooperation would be needed going forward. And in particular, I think it's important for us to recognize the need to multilateralize the agreement, because a series of bilateral agreements can be very, very clumsy, especially in these are needed in situations of emergency, not in normal situations. So you want to go forward very quickly with that. I want to emphasize that people who are often seen as the most conservative in many of our societies, the central banks, leadership, in recent times have been a bit more bold, and they have not simply repeated the mantra of US Fed chair of inflation targeting at to ensure the inflation of no more than 2%, and so on and so forth. Instead, what we see, especially during the pandemic, two governments of Southeast Asia, one had to change its constitution, and the other introduced very special legislation to enable what some economists would call monetary financing. In other words, of direct lending from central banks directly to the how should I put it, to the treasuries, okay, bypassing markets. And this, I think, is very important precedent. Now, I'm not suggesting that central banks continue to do so with no checks and balances, but it's a very important precedent because it basically means that the usual constraints are no longer as binding as they might have seemed, and you basically have a situation where you open up central banks basically are able to generate funds. Now, this doesn't mean that developing countries' central banks, even in Southeast Asia, can do, for example, what the US can do, which is basically to print money on an unlimited basis. But it basically opens up a certain degree of policy space in terms of monetary policy. But we have to remember that the international monetary system, as my old professor Robert Triffin used to say, after 1971, when Richard Nixon withdrew the US from all its obligations under the Bretton Woods system, what we have had essentially is a situation of international monetary anarchy, which Robert Triffin politely referred to as a non-system. But in this anarchy, it is not as if the whole situation then becomes favorable as long as the world is confident in the US dollars. The moment that confidence in the US dollar breaks, then we may have a very difficult situation and very problematic situation, which I don't particularly envy. But I think it is important to recognize how vulnerable the world economy as a whole is in the unlikely event for the time being, event of a breakdown of confidence. You know, one of the points which Katharina Pistor makes is that, you know, there has to be an acceptance of certain norms for law to work. Law cannot work simply by imposition, but also requires legitimacy, the acceptance of certain norms. And what we find right now is a situation where many norms have been thrown to the wind. We have a situation, for example, where, you know, property of governments is being the property of various governments has basically been confiscated on a unilateral basis by NATO countries and so on. And I'm not referring, of course, not only to Russia, but also to Iran, but also to Venezuela and a whole range of other countries. So you basically have a situation where everybody feels threatened, everybody feels held to ransom, that if you step out of line, you know, everything is going to be thrown at you. And so you maintain the system not through legitimacy, not through acceptance, but through basically coercion. And this basically means that, you know, people like Joseph Nye, for example, who talk about the significance of Joseph Nye and what's his name? Anyway, the two at Harvard who talk about the importance of soft power. The significance of soft power is being undermined by the very beneficiaries of the system of soft power which exists in the world today. So we have a very, very uncertain world where many of these norms, which are so essential for the legitimacy and the functioning of a system, are basically being undermined. Thank you.
Many thanks, Jomo, for your very your wide-ranging and very interesting talk, and also your wide-ranging and interesting answers to these challenging questions. We have more questions in the chat, but our time has run out, and so we need to take a break. And many thanks to Jomo and to everyone for participating. We'll be resuming in 15 minutes with our second speaker here live in concert, Yulen Kaur. He'll be speaking about Southeast Asia's green supply chain. So we'll look forward to that shortly. And in the meantime, many thanks to Jomo. Join me in thanking him the usual way, and thanks to you all for joining.